Welcome back. Welcome to the Premier Mindset by Premier Performance LLC. I'm your host, Trent Mailer, LCSW, licensed clinical therapist and performance coach, and this is episode 70. There's a moment in elite sports that most people misunderstand completely. It's not the championship game. It's not the highlight reel. It's not even the losing streak. It's the quiet shift that happens inside a coach-athlete relationship when both people are still technically winning, but something underneath it stops feeling aligned. From the outside, everything looks functional. Results are still there, training is still happening, the program still looks elite. But internally, something starts to tighten. Communication gets shorter, feedback gets more selective, questions start to feel like challenges instead of curiosity. And neither person is fully aware that they've already stopped operating as a unified system. Most people assume breakdowns happen when performance drops. That's not what actually happens, though. Performance drops because the relationship quietly breaks first. A coach who was once guiding now starts managing. An athlete who was once absorbing now starts filtering. And what used to be collaboration slowly becomes negotiation. Not openly, not aggressively, but subtly enough that both people can still tell themselves the relationship is fine while their behavior is already shifting in opposite directions. This is where elite partnerships begin to fail, long before anyone is willing to admit it. And the most dangerous part is that success doesn't prevent it. In many cases, success accelerates it, because success changes how authority is felt inside the relationship. The athlete starts realizing they have more leverage than they used to. The coach starts realizing their decisions are being evaluated more than they're being followed. And what was once a shared mission quietly starts turning into two separate interpretations of what winning actually means. Quick note before we dive in, this podcast is for education and performance growth. It's not a replacement for therapy or medical treatment. If there's something you need, make sure you go and get it. Social media accounts are all linked in the episode description below. Make sure you follow along and get involved in those communities as we continue to grow. Now let's get back into it. First, let me ground this in something real. Imagine a championship level athlete who has been under a respected coach for years. Early in the relationship, everything works because the hierarchy is clear. The coach leads, the athlete follows, trust is built through repetition and results. But as the athlete improves, they begin to notice things. Small decisions in training they would have never questioned before now feel slightly off. Not wrong, just misaligned with how they feel their game is evolving. So they ask questions. At first, the coach receives those questions as engagement. But over time, those questions start to feel like resistance. Now something subtle shifts. The coach tightens structure, more detail, more correction, more control. Not because they're trying to dominate, but because they're trying to preserve performance standards they believe are being threatened. Meanwhile, the athlete doesn't feel guided anymore. They start feeling constrained. And without either of them realizing it, the relationship begins reorganizing itself around control instead of development. This is the first place where most people completely misdiagnose what is happening. They assume it's a personality issue, or a communication issue, or a respect issue. But what's actually happening is far more precise. Role clarity is dissolving. The athlete is no longer just an athlete. The coach is no longer just a coach. And when roles become unclear, trust doesn't disappear all at once. It becomes conditional. It becomes situational. It becomes something both people have to constantly test without ever explicitly saying they're testing it. This is where the relationship alignment starts to matter more than the training plan itself. Because you can have the best programming in the world, the best technical instruction, the best system, and still lose everything if the relationship underneath it is no longer aligned. And yet almost nobody ever formally checks that alignment. They assume it exists because results exist. But results can hide misalignment for a long time. That's where something like relationship alignment audit becomes essential, even if no one calls it that in real time. The idea is simple. Are both people still operating from the same definition of success? Are they still interpreting feedback through the same lens? Are they still committed to the same version of the athlete's development? Or has one person started optimizing for performance output while the other is optimizing for autonomy and evolution? Most partnerships never ask those questions directly. They assume shared mission, but assumptions is where drift begins. And when drift begins, feedback starts to change. That's where another subtle shift happens. The athlete no longer hears feedback as purely developmental. They start filtering it through trust. Do I trust this? Does this match what I feel? Is this still aligned with where I think I am going? And the coach, sensing that shift, starts adjusting how feedback is delivered. Less open-ended, more directive. Less exploratory, more corrective. Because uncertainty in leadership often triggers control, not curiosity. This is where feedback safety becomes critical, even though most people never define it. Feedback safety is not about being soft. It's about whether feedback can still be received without triggering defensiveness or identity protection. Because once feedback starts threatening identity, instead of developing performance, the learning system starts shutting down. The athlete doesn't stop listening because they lack discipline. They stop listening because their nervous system begins interpreting correction as misalignment instead of guidance. There's a role clarity breakdown that happens right here that most elite environments never recover from. The athlete starts subtly asking, am I being developed or directed? And the coach starts subtly asking, am I being respected or questioned? And now both people are no longer fully inside the same mission. They're inside parallel interpretations of it. And this is the part most people miss completely. From the outside, nothing looks broken yet. Training still happens, meetings still happen, competition still happens. But internally, the system is no longer fully integrated. It is two high-level performers operating inside the same environment, but no longer inside the same psychological structure. This is where role confusion becomes the silent failure point. Not talent, not effort, not knowledge. Role confusion. And if you zoom out far enough, you start to see the real pattern in elite sports. The partnerships that last are not always the ones with the most talent on both sides. They're the ones where role clarity is continuously maintained even as performance evolves. Because evolution always pressures roles. Improvement always shifts identity. And without constant recalibration, even the best partnership begins to drift. That's why something like the role clarity review becomes necessary, not as a formal meeting, but as a repeated check inside the relationship. What is my role right now in this phase of development? What is yours? What has changed since last season, last month, last performance cycle? Because if those answers are not actively updated, they are silently rewritten by behavior instead of intention. And this is the dangerous part. Nobody announces when the shift happens. There's no moment where someone says, we are no longer aligned. It just shows up in tone, in hesitation, in interpretation, in the way feedback lands slightly heavier than it used to, and the way questions start to feel like challenges instead of curiosity. And by the time performance starts slipping, the real problem is already far upstream. It was never the athlete's talent. It was never the coach's knowledge. It was the slow collapse of the shared psychological structure. And once that structure begins to break, even great intentions start to work against each other. The partnership doesn't fail because respect disappears. It fails because collaboration quietly turns into competition. That's the part most people never see until it's already too late. When you zoom in on the breakdown of great coach-athlete relationships, it almost never starts with effort. It almost never starts with knowledge. And it rarely starts with talent. What actually shifts first is something far more subtle and far more dangerous. Power begins to reorganize itself inside the relationship, even when no one openly acknowledges it. The athlete gets better, more visible, more confident in their own interpretations of performance. The coach, who once felt essential to every decision, starts to feel the edge of that control getting softer. Not gone, just less absolute. And that subtle shift is where the relationship begins to fracture in ways most people never see until it's already too late. The confusing part is that both people believe they are doing the right thing. The coach starts tightening structure, giving more precise instructions, correcting smaller details, believing that refinement is what separates good from great. The athlete, on the other hand, starts feeling like autonomy is shrinking. They begin questioning whether they are being developed or directed, whether they are being trusted or managed. Neither of them wakes up deciding to create tension, but both of them begin protecting something internally. The coach protects authority. The athlete protects ownership. And what used to be a shared mission slowly becomes a silent negotiation over control. This is where identity begins to override performance, because now every interaction carries weight beyond the actual decision being discussed. A correction is no longer just feedback. It becomes a signal about respect. A question is no longer curiosity. It becomes interpreted as resistance. A disagreement is no longer tactical. It becomes psychological. The relationship stops existing inside the work and starts existing inside the interpretation. And once interpretation replaces clarity, even simple conversations begin to feel loaded. Picture a film room after a disappointing performance. The tape is paused halfway through a sequence that should have been routine. The coach is focused on positioning, spacing, timing, but the tone is sharper than usual. Not angry, but tightened. The athlete is listening, but not fully receiving. Instead, they're scanning, not the film, but the meaning behind the words. When the coach points out a missed assignment or a missed adjustment, the athlete responds with justification instead of curiosity. When the athlete asks a question, the coach hears challenge instead of inquiry. No one says anything about explicitly wrong, but the environment becomes heavier with every exchange. The focus is no longer improvement. It is defense. Subtle, quiet, internal defense. This is where great partnerships begin to collapse under their own success, because success raises the stakes of identity. The coach begins to feel that if the athlete stops responding, it reflects on their competence. The athlete begins to feel that if they comply too much, they lose their edge. So both begin adjusting in ways that preserve identity rather than maximize performance. The coach becomes more rigid. The athlete becomes more selective. And what looks like disagreement on the surface is actually identity protection underneath it. This is why so many elite athletes start resisting coaching they once embraced. It is not because they suddenly stopped valuing guidance. It is because guidance started feeling like control when identity is under pressure. It is also why many coaches become more rigid at the exact moment flexibility is required, because rigidity feels like stability when authority feels threatened. Neither is acting irrationally from their own perspective, but both are operating from self-protection instead of shared execution. If you want to understand where this shifts in real time, it usually shows up in three places. First, in how feedback is received. Second, in how decisions are questioned. Third, in how responsibility is assigned after failure. These are not just performance moments. These are psychological signals. And when those signals are misread, the relationship starts to fracture in ways that look tactical, but are actually relational. One of the most important tools at this stage is what we would call identity separation. Not separating people from accountability, but separating identity from disagreement. Because in high-level environments, disagreement is inevitable. What destroys relationships and partnerships is when disagreements become identity threat. When I don't agree starts feeling like I don't respect you. When let's adjust this starts feeling like you are the problem. Without that separation, even the best intentions start to feel like attacks. This is also where curiosity becomes a leadership requirement, not a personality trait. The most effective coaches in these environments are not the ones who always correct first. They're the ones who can pause long enough to ask what is actually happening in the athlete's interpretation before responding. Because correction without understanding creates resistance. But curiosity before corrections restores alignment. It slows down the identity reflex that turns feedback into conflict. And then there is the power balance, not in the formal sense, but in the psychological sense. Every elite relationship has a shifting center of influence. When that shift is ignored, one side starts overcompensating. The coach may increase control mechanisms. The athlete may increase autonomy behaviors. And suddenly the relationship is no longer about performance optimization. It is about equilibrium restoration. Both people are trying to feel stable again, but they are using control instead of communication to get there. There's a moment in almost every high-level coach-athlete dynamic where this becomes unavoidable. When both sides realizing they are not interpreting each other clearly anymore, but neither side wants to be the one who backs down. That is where repair conversations matter, not as conflict resolution after breakdown, but as maintenance before collapse. Conversations that are not about who is right, but about what is being lost in translation, what is being assumed instead of asked, what is being protected instead of shared. Because here's the truth that most people miss. The moment winning becomes less important than being right, elite performance begins to die. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, through small moments of disconnection that compound over time. A correction that lands incorrectly, a reaction that wasn't necessary, a silence that should have been a question. And suddenly, two people who have once accelerated each other are now slowing each other down. By the end of this stage, you should recognize something critical. Leadership in elite environments is not primarily about authority. It is about adaptability under pressure. Because authority alone cannot hold a relationship together when identity is being challenged on both sides. What holds it together is the ability to stay connected while role shifts, while emotions rise, and while interpretations differ. Without that flexibility, even the most talented partnerships begin to collapse under their own weight. And once you see that clearly, you stop assuming breakdowns happen from a lack of knowledge. You start recognizing them as failure of psychological adaptations inside the relationship itself. When you zoom out from emotional tension of coach-athlete breakdowns, something becomes clear that most people miss entirely. These relationships do not fall apart because of a single argument, a bad game, or a difficult conversation. They fall apart because the system underneath the relationship was never designed for the level of psychological pressure that elite performance creates. At lower levels, communication alone can hold things together. At higher levels, communication is not enough. You need structure around how two high-performance identities interact under stress, disagreement, and uncertainty. Without that structure, even good intention starts producing friction instead of alignment. This is where elite coaching stops being about instruction and starts becoming about relationship engineering. Because once an athlete reaches a certain level, they already know what to do in most situations. What determines whether you can actually execute is not information, but emotional accessibility under pressure. And that accessibility is shaped by whether the relationship around them creates safety or threat. If feedback feels like evaluation of identity, resistance increases. If feedback feels like collaboration on performance, openness increases. The same message can produce completely different outcomes dependent on the relationship system it exists inside. One of the most important shifts at this level is psychological safety. Not comfort, not softness. Safety in the sense that truth can be exchanged without either person needing to defend themselves. Because once defense enters the system, learning decreases. The athlete stops absorbing and starts filtering. The coach stops observing and starts controlling. And the space between them become less about performance improvement and more about protecting emotional position. This is where many elite partnerships quietly stall, even if externally everything still looks functional. A practical way to understand this is through alignment meetings. Not the formal version people often imagine, but structured conversations that reset expectations before misalignment compounds. These are moments where both coach and athlete step out of performance mode and recalibrate shared direction. What are we actually solving for right now? What is working? What is being misinterpreted? What needs to change in how we communicate? Not just what we communicate. When these conversations are absent, assumptions take over, and assumptions are where most breakdowns begin. There's also a critical distinction between autonomy and abandonment that gets blurred in elite environments. Athletes need autonomy to perform at their highest level, but they also need connection to structure that keeps them aligned. When coaches overcorrect towards control, autonomy collapses and resistance rises. When coaches step too far back, the athlete may feel unsupported and begin filling the gap with their own interpretations, which may or may not align with the system. The most effective environments are not built on maximum control or maximum freedom. They're built on adaptive leadership, where influence shifts based on context, readiness, and emotional state. This is where an adaptive coaching model becomes essential. Instead of treating every athlete interaction the same way, the coach learns to adjust approach based on psychological readiness. Sometimes direct correction is appropriate. Sometimes observation is more powerful. Sometimes silence does more than instruction. And sometimes asking the right question does more than giving the right answer. The mistake many coaches make is assuming consistency means sameness. In reality, consistency in elite environments comes from alignment of intent, not uniformity of approach. There is a moment I have seen repeatedly in high-performance environments where everything shifts internally. A coach realizes that saying more is not creating more clarity. It is creating resistance. And an athlete realizes that hearing more is not creating more growth. It is creating overload. At that point, both sides start recognizing that the problem is not effort or intelligence. It is signal quality inside the relationship. Too much noise, too little processing space, too much correction without enough integration. This is where trust repair becomes a skill, not an apology. Because even in the best environments, misalignment will happen. What separates sustainable partnership from collapsing ones is not avoiding conflict, but the ability to repair quickly and accurately when it does occur, because it will. A conflict recovery framework is not about who is right. It is about restoring clarity faster than damage compounds. What was the intention? What was received? What was actually meant? What needs to be adjusted going forward? Without that layer, small misunderstandings harden into identity narratives. And once that happens, everything becomes heavier than it used to be, than it needs to be. I want to make something personal here for a moment, because it matters at this level. There was a period where I realized I was defaulting to speaking more when things felt uncertain. More explanation, more clarity, more detail, thinking that added value. But what it was actually doing was increasing cognitive load for the other person. When I slowed that down and started prioritizing listening over input, I noticed something shift immediately. The quality of understanding improved, even though the quantity of communication decreased. That is counterintuitive in high-performance environments where more often feels like better. But in reality, precision beats volume every single time. This is also where feedback receptivity becomes a shared responsibility, not just an athlete trait. It is easy to assume some athletes are simply better at receiving feedback than others. But in most elite environments, receptivity is a function of how safe, clear, and aligned the feedback system is. If the system is inconsistent, defensive, or emotionally unpredictable, even the best athletes begin filtering instead of absorbing. If the system is structured, calm, and aligned, even difficult feedback becomes usable information rather than emotional threat. This is why mutual accountability agreements matter. Because in high-performance environments, accountability cannot flow in only one direction without creating imbalance. When only the athlete is accountable, the coach becomes a judge. When only the coach is accountable, the athlete becomes passive. But when both parties agree on what responsibility looks like inside this relationship, the dynamic shifts from authority to partnership. And partnership is what sustains performance under pressure. At the core of all of this is a simple but uncomfortable truth. Elite athletes do not need less coaching. They need different coaching. Coaching that adapts to psychological state. Coaching that prioritizes clarity over volume. Coaching that understands timing matters as much as content. Coaching that treats trust as something that must be maintained, not assumed. Because once trust erodes, even the best information loses its impact. And if you understand that deeply, you start to see why some of the most talented coach-athlete pairings in sports quietly fall apart, even while everyone on the outside assumes they should be dominating. It was never about knowledge. It was never about effort. It was about whether the relationship could evolve as fast as the performance demands required it to. By the end of this section, you should understand something foundational. Trust is not a personality trait. It is not something you either have or do not have. It is trainable. It is maintainable. It is engineered through repeated alignment, repair, and adaptive communication. And once you understand that, the final question becomes unavoidable. If trust can be trained, what would change in the way you lead, coach, or compete starting today? At a certain point in elite coaching, something shifts that many people outside of high-performance environments never see. The best coaches stop trying to prove they are the smartest person in the room. They stop trying to win conversations. They stop trying to validate their methods through control or dominance. And instead, they start focusing on something far more difficult to measure, but infinitely more powerful. They start focusing on whether the people they lead can eventually outperform them without losing themselves in the process. That is where coaching stops being about authority and starts becoming about legacy. Because the truth is, control can produce compliance, but it cannot produce greatness that lasts. You can force alignment in short term. You can tighten structure, increase discipline, and extract performance through pressure. But over time, that approach creates dependency, resistance, or quiet disengagement. And what looks like discipline from the outside often feels like constraint from the inside. The moment an athlete feels they are being shaped more than they are being understood, something subtle begins to fracture in the relationship. Not immediately, not obviously, but gradually, through diminishing trust and increasing emotional distance. Great coaches eventually recognize that their job is not to be the central decision maker in every moment. Their job is to build a system where decision making becomes shared, adaptive, and responsive to reality in real time. That requires a level of humility that is often uncomfortable in elite environments, because it means accepting that influence is more powerful than control. And influence only works when the other person feels ownership over the process, not just obedience to the instruction. This is a point in almost every long-term coach-athlete relationship where the question is no longer, do I trust your knowledge? But instead, do I feel like I have the space to become myself under the guidance? And if that question is not answered well, even the most talented pairings begin to drift apart. Not because of disagreement, but because the misalignment in how growth is experienced. One side may still believe they're building excellence, while the other side begins to feel shaped in ways that no longer match their identity. This is where servant leadership becomes the difference maker. Not in the watered down sense people often associate it with, but in the precise psychological sense of prioritizing the long-term development of the athlete over the short-term validation of the coach. Servant leadership in elite environments means you are willing to step back when stepping forward would create dependency. It means you're willing to stay quiet when speaking would create resistance. It means you're willing to let the athlete own the moment, even when you see a better path, because ownership is what ultimately creates mastery. And when that mindset is missing, even successful environments start to degrade from the inside. The coach begins to feel unappreciated. The athlete begins to feel overmanaged. Communication becomes transactional instead of developmental. And what used to feel like a shared pursuit becomes two separate interpretations of the same goal. Both still care, both still want to win, but they are no longer building in the same direction with the same psychological intent. This is also where long-term partnership reviews become essential. Not in the sense of performance evaluation alone, but in the sense of relational alignment over time. Because relationships at this level do not fail in single moments. They fail in accumulation. Small misalignments that were never addressed. Small misunderstandings that were never clarified. Small ego reactions that were never repaired. Over time, those small fractures become the difference between a relationship that scales with performance and one that collapses under it. Mutual accountability systems also matter here in a way most people underestimate. When accountability only flows one direction, power becomes distorted. But when both coach and athlete agree on how they are responsible to the relationship itself, something stabilizes. The dynamic shifts from evaluation to partnership, from correction to collaboration, from hierarchy to shared ownership. And that shift is what allows performance to remain sustainable under pressure instead of collapsing under expectation. There's something important to understand about legacy in this space. Legacy is not built in championships alone. It is built in the quality of the people who leave your environment and how they perform when they are no longer in the room. A coach can win at the highest level and still leave behind athletes who struggle without structure. Or they can build athletes who carry forward clarity, adaptability, and confidence long after the relationship ends. The difference is not knowledge. It is how that knowledge was delivered, shared, and internalized over time. And when you look at it through that lens, a difficult truth emerges. Many careers are not ended by injury. They're ended by relationships that slowly stop serving the mission, not because anyone made a single catastrophic mistake, but because alignment eroded quietly over time. Trust weakened, communication narrowed, roles hardened, and what once felt like a partnership became a structure held together by history rather than direction. The strongest coaches eventually understand that adaptation is not optional at the highest level. It's the requirement for sustainability. They learn to shift between structure and freedom, instruction and autonomy, correction and observation, depending on what the relationship needs in that moment. That is adaptive leadership. And it is what allows excellence to remain flexible instead of brittle. When you combine all of this, something becomes very clear. Great coaching is not about being right more often than the athlete. It's not about having the final word. It's not even about maximizing control over performance variables. Great coaching is about building environments where excellence can survive beyond the presence of authority, where the athlete is not dependent on the coach to access their best self, but instead has learned how to access it consistently on their own. That is real transformation, not control, but transfer, not dependency, but capability, not authority, but development. And when that happens, that relationship stops being defined by hierarchy and starts being defined by shared evolution. Because at the end of the day, you don't remember the coaches who controlled the most. You remember the ones who helped athletes become something they could sustain long after the relationship ended. The ones who built clarity instead of confusion, ownership instead of dependence, confidence instead of hesitation. And when you zoom all the way out, That is the only version of coaching that actually lasts. Great coaches are remembered for the athletes they helped become themselves, not for the athletes they tried to control. With all that, resilient minds, premier results. That's what we're building here. That's what we're talking about here. And we're trying to set ourselves up through the premier mindset so you guys are able to operate at these highest levels with everything that you're doing. And on top of that, recognition is always the first step. If you don't see something happening, you can't do anything about it to fix it. You can't change it. You can't adjust it. On top of that, as always, this episode is meant to provide tools for performance, not replace individualized therapy. If you're struggling with anxiety, burnout, or persistent stress, professional guidance is critical. At Premier Performance LLC, we work with high achievers to implement strategies like these with precision, accountability, and results. I make it a point to give you actionable tools to find success in your life. Let me know if it's helping. I love staying connected with all of you. If it is helpful and is working, great. I love it. Let me know. If you're struggling with it and you're not getting the result you want, that's okay. Again, let me know. I'd love to help. I'd love to hear how this episode itself specifically is helping. Is it helpful? Is it not? Did it feel like it landed on something you wanted it to? Did it feel like it missed out and there was something that I didn't touch on? Share it with me. I'd love to give you guys more of what you're looking for, but I'd love to also be known what that is. On top of it, if it was helpful and beneficial in some way, share it with others. I love to share these things with as many people as possible just to spread the awareness and get it to as many people as possible so they can work at the highest levels they can. With that, there are a lot of different ways to reach out to me. If there is anything on your mind, questions, concerns, things you want to figure out a little bit more or get a little bit deeper into, feel free to reach out and ask me about it. You can email me at tmailer@premierperformancereno.com. My last name spelled Mahler. You can text or call me directly at 775-561-0056. The Instagram and the TikTok both have the same name, which is premier_performance_Reno for both of those. The Facebook page and the LinkedIn page both are the same as well, which is Premier Performance LLC. And then we have the Twitter or the X account, which is at Premier Reno LLC, followed by our website, which is www.premierperformancereno.com. So reach out, get involved. If there's anything I can do to help, let me know. Next week, we're going to talk about how social media is quietly damaging competitive athletes. And I think this is going to be really helpful in a lot of ways because we don't always think about this. And quite often, we just accept social media as it is and not think about what it's actually doing and how it's stopping us from doing what we want to do. So go be the best you can be, put yourself out there, do the things that scare you a little bit, and try and put yourself in a spot doing things you haven't done before. Because to do things you haven't done before means you're able to get to these levels that you haven't been at before. So be the best you can, put yourself out there. If there's anything you need, let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you guys next week and we'll keep on going from there. Have a good one.